Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another seminar on the fascinating world of college admissions. I'm your host, Patrick Tapia, VP for Counseling for HS2 Academy. So tonight we're going to be focusing on things to do for the upcoming college application cycle for fall of 2024, leading up to 2025, of course. Now, this will certainly be much more relevant if you're going to be a rising senior. This is definitely going to be helpful and very germane to what you're going to be dealing with. But this is obviously very useful information still, especially if you're a younger student and then be able to use all the information you learn from this to prepare over a longer period of time, right? So it's definitely going to be helpful to understand what's going on in college admissions these days. And I'll be giving you a lot of helpful tips and advice in terms of what to do, what to improve on in different aspects of your high school career leading up to eventually your college application phase. Okay, so we do ask that you refrain from recording of the information here. We do upload these videos, or at least bits of these or snippets of these in YouTube. So if there's anything here that you find interesting that you want to rewatch, feel free to go ahead and check HS2's YouTube channel. All right, so the changing landscape of college admissions. So many of the colleges have started releasing their acceptance rates for this past year for their overall rates. In the last couple of seminars I gave you, I shared with you some of the early action or early decision acceptance rates, but now we're starting to get a trickle of some of the overall acceptance rates. Now, to be fair, not all colleges have released their results. So as you can see here, I have the results from 5 out of the 8 Ivy League schools. So we don't have Princeton, we don't have UPenn, and we don't have, I believe, Cornell, because they've started withholding those scores until a little bit later in the process. So we only get their acceptance rates maybe about like anywhere from 6 months to a year after some of these other schools have done. And, you know, Stanford does the same thing. I think they're doing so in large part to sort of help minimize a little bit of the anxiety about college admissions. Nonetheless, you know, we can always estimate, we can always project. It's probably not going to be too far away from what their acceptance rates were from last year. And as you can see here, some of the good news, I suppose, the silver lining in all this is that it's not a given anymore year after year that the acceptance rates always go down. To be sure, you have like Yale and Dartmouth that are getting increasingly more selective. Yale's now down to under 4%. Joining the likes of Harvard and Columbia. But Dartmouth is getting a lot more selective. I think not too long ago, Dartmouth used to have like something like a 10 to 12% acceptance rate. But now it's joining the ranks of the other Ivies in terms of, you know, soon it'll be under 5%, much like the other Ivy League schools as well. Okay, so as you can see here, Harvard's actually been increasing the last 3 years or so, as has Brown. Obviously not by much. So it's at least reached a level where it's sort of like stabilized a bit. I guess during the pandemic years, we saw a massive dip in terms of the acceptance rates because the number of applications skyrocketed for these schools. So there's a bit of a correction here that's going on in terms of like it finally sort of stabilizing. Now, this is not a trend that's unique to the Ivy Leagues, of course, right? So if we take a look at some of the more selective private universities that are non-Ivies, we see some of these numbers actually decreasing kind of substantially for some of them, right? So one of the trends that you've heard me talk about maybe in previous seminars, if you've seen my seminars, is that there's a rising popularity of the selected private universities that are in major metropolitan areas. Now, of course, we know MIT in Boston and then U Chicago, they've always been really, really competitive. But even universities that have been called, you know, considered like maybe mid-range or target schools in the past or like a likely schools, those are changing really quickly. So you can see Boston University now falling to about the 10 or 11% acceptance rate, down from about 14% 2 years ago. Right. Johns Hopkins, always a top school, is now very, very close to reaching the ranks of the Ivies. Even schools like Rice in Houston, USC in Los Angeles, and NYU are now sub 10% consistently, right? So some of these numbers may be shocking to some of you, especially if you, let's say, are a parent who's had children apply to these colleges maybe like 5 to 10 years ago, or if you're a fairly young parent yourself who applied to these schools, the game's changing. Some of these schools have gotten a lot more competitive, and so we need to sort of keep pace in terms of our information about how selective some of these colleges are. So Northwestern, obviously very, very competitive. One of the shockers I didn't put in here is Northeastern technically now has a lower acceptance rate than Northwestern. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Northeastern has the same academic reputation as Northwestern, but nonetheless, it is definitely good to keep up to date in terms of these acceptance rates and see how competitive these schools are so that you don't necessarily put yourself in a position where schools that you're labeling as like, oh, I'm going to get in this school or my kid's going to get in this school, and then only to find out that it's actually become much, much more competitive than you had realized. Now, the UC system, because I know a lot of the people who are listening to us are either in California or interested in applying to college in California, has also gotten a little bit more competitive over the last few years. But on the bright side of things, though, I think for a lot of these UCs, it hasn't been a steady decrease. Last couple of years or so, it's kind of like also like the Ivy sort of stabilized. And I think this is sort of like we got the peak with COVID and everything, the number of applications skyrocketed. And so now the last couple of years, it's sort of like stabilized a little bit. So it's not dipping as dramatically anymore. So as you can see here, these are predicted rates. Usually the UCs don't release their actual admit information or their admit data until late in the summer, usually around July or maybe very early August. So these are estimates. And in previous years, when I've done this, it's actually very close. It's within like maybe 0.5 of a percentage point. In many cases less. So we can use these as estimates. And so what I do is I take a look at the number of applicants, which is something they've already released. And we look at the predicted number of admits using last year's numbers, and it's oftentimes going to be very close. So what we're projecting here is UCLA is probably going to remain very, very close to last year's 8.76%. UC Berkeley would probably go up a little tiny bit, right? Not by much, of course. Now for the mid-tier UCs, we have much the same, right? So I put in red the ones that decrease, but even those decreases aren't necessarily very dramatic, as you can see here. Santa Barbara is projected to increase slightly. Davis decreased close to 2%, so that's actually fairly substantial. Now, for the rest of the UCs, we do have some pretty dramatic drops, especially for UC Merced. We're projecting that it's going to be about 80%, which is actually quite a substantial dip because, I mean, Merced used to be like the baby of the UC system. It used to be like the youngest UC, right? So it's only about 20 or 25 years old, which is relatively young as far as like most universities go, right? But it's a pretty new university overall. But even most recently, Merced just cracked like the top 60 or 70 for US News rankings. So even they are getting a lot more competitive as well as the rest of the UC system gets more and more competitive. There used to be a time when Merced used to just accept everybody, like, 98, 97% acceptance rates. So now at 80%, they can afford to be a little bit more selective as well. In prior years, it wasn't surprising for counselors to get sort of updates from UC Merced saying like, hey, we know it's already like April or May, but we're still accepting applicants if you want to send in an application to UC Merced because they needed to fill some of those remaining spots for their freshman class. Not the case anymore, right? I think they've refrained from doing that the last couple of years or so because they've gotten a lot more selective. Okay, now with this in mind, seeing how competitive the landscape is, it's important for us to kind of come up with ways. So how do you stand out? How do you find ways to make yourself more competitive so that these colleges will take notice and hopefully be able to select you despite a lot of other, equally qualified applicants? So what I would like to do is take a look at some of the factors that these schools look at, and I will be using the NACAC selection factors survey. So in most years, the NACAC, which is the National Association for College Admissions Counselors, which is the governing body of all the different college admissions counselors or admissions officers out there, and also high school guidance counselors. And they do a survey in most years when they do the NACAC seminar, and they use this to try to figure out like what are the most important factors that colleges are taking a look at. So no surprise here, the most important factors are going to be the academic ones, as you can see here. So it's your grades, your total high school grades overall, and the strength of your curriculum. All sort of kind of combined together, right? So I wouldn't say that the actual pure GPA is any more important than, let's say, the strength of the curriculum. They're all sort of factored in contextually and holistically, okay? Next, they'll also be taking a look now at things like your positive character attributes, which I lumped here with the essay or the writing sample because this is one of the most visible ways that they use to evaluate, your character. Like, who are you as a person? What do you value? What are your strengths? And that's definitely one of the things that colleges are taking heed of, more so than in previous years. Okay. Beyond that, of course, recommendation letters are also being evaluated at a very high level. So many people know about the teacher recommendation. One of the less sort of known factors is that your high school guidance counselor also needs to write a recommendation letter for you. And so one of the key things I'll be talking about in today's seminar is how do you build those relationships? How do you let these counselors and these teachers know more about you so that they can write recommendations that make you stand out relative to the other people that they're writing recommendation letters for? One of the key things that I will tell students is that it's not always best to pick a teacher who necessarily has a good reputation of writing very glowing, flowery recommendations, because if they do it for everybody, then how are you going to stand out, right? Sometimes it's best to actually pick a good teacher who is a little bit more sparing in terms of who they write good rec letters for. And hopefully you would be one of the people that they'd write a strong rec letter for. So, I'll give you some tips in terms of how to weigh in terms of evaluating which teachers eventually would be the best, most suitable ones to write you the recommendations. We'll also talk about, of course, your extracurricular activities. What are some things that will make you stand out, be more competitive in the eyes of many colleges? And last but not least, admissions testing, things like the SAT or ACT. I don't know if you've been paying attention to some of the articles recently, but there have been some announcements, especially by the Ivies, where many of the Ivies are now bringing back the SAT requirement, of course, including the ACT as well. So that's definitely something that's a little bit of a game changer in terms of students now having to pay heed to that and then having to go ahead and, plan and prepare for that. So if you're a rising senior and you haven't really done much in terms of testing, you definitely need to account for that, hopefully this summer, and hopefully try to take one of the earlier tests in the school year next year, maybe as early as August, September, or October, so that you have a competitive score, just so you don't end up shut out of having to apply to schools that do end up requiring it, because it's only really going to be a matter of time before most schools again start requiring the SAT or ACT. For many years the SAT was considered optional because of COVID, but I think now that there's not really much sense of rationale for why students can't take the SAT or ACT anymore, many colleges are feeling like, hey, it's a useful tool. We could use this to help us evaluate students much more so and determine who would be qualified to attend our school. Okay, so let's take a look. So your academic record is still your priority number one, all right? So let's take a look at what that means. So as I said, not just your high school grades and college prep classes, but your total grades, your GPA and everything, but as well, they weigh it with your high school strength of your curriculum. So it's not simply like if you're straight A's, but you don't take any challenging courses, that they would think that that's a good thing. And then conversely, if you take the most challenging classes at your school, but you end up getting bad grades, that's not going to impress anyone either. So typically what I tell students is that you do have to have a balance between the two. Okay, you want to strive to maintain the best possible grades that you can get while also maintaining a very rigorous course schedule. Now, does that mean maxing out and taking an AP at every opportunity? Not necessarily, right? Because if you take on more than you can, more than you can chew, so to speak, that could definitely harm you too. And then, you don't look as competitive. Now, like I said, you do want to have that right balance of a schedule where you can be competitive, you can do well in these classes. Now, if you end up getting a B or two, it's not a deal breaker. We've had many students still get into a lot of top colleges, even with a B or two. But obviously these days, with how competitive these top colleges like the Ivies or Ivy level kind of school like a Stanford or MIT, you need to strive to get as close to straight A's as possible, okay? So without further ado, let's talk about it. So what do colleges do when they evaluate your application? Well, the first thing they look at here is that they want to see that you're taking a rigorous college prep schedule, right? So that you're taking courses that prepare you for college, right? So this include things like honors classes and, when appropriate, AP or IB courses, okay? And you want to be demonstrating that you can do well in these classes, right? So many of the top, most highly selective colleges, they don't look at your GPA in a vacuum, right? So some parents, some students are of the belief that, hey, you know what? I have a friend who has like 0.2 GPA higher than me. Like I have a 4.3, this person has a 4.5. Oh, automatically they'll pick this person instead of me. It doesn't always work out that way, right? So it's not always like a pure GPA will be that trump card that allows a student to beat another student, okay? They take a look at what you're able to do, right? And they measure your success and your excellence based on the choices you made and the context of what you're able to achieve in high school. So I know that's kind of a vague term there, or a vague sort of description of how they evaluate it, but that's kind of really the way they do it. They take a look at it. They look at the context of like what you're able to do. They look at your recommendation letters. They see whether or not you've actually achieved success despite maybe some adversity or challenges that you might have overcome. Right. So a pure GPA isn't weighted in a vacuum, and it's often contextualized to what the school offers. So in other words, let's say you attend a high school where they only offer a certain number of AP classes. They're not going to think necessarily that your performance is any worse than, let's say, for example, if there's a neighboring high school that has something like AP classes available to freshmen, in which case maybe their max GPA is like a 4.7, 4.8 or higher even. So they evaluate things based on the context of what your school has to offer, right? Oftentimes your school counselor will submit something called a school profile where the colleges know what is available, right? And what courses that you can or can't take, right? So also your GPA isn't evaluated in compared to other schools in absolute terms. So what that means is that your GPA isn't compared like on an apples to apples basis with a different other high school, because there are high schools even out there that are very, very competitive that simply don't offer AP or IB courses or don't even have a weighted GPA. Okay, so in this case, this is why college admissions offices typically have counselors who are very intimately familiar with certain high schools, certain districts, right, that are part of what's called their territory, right? So many colleges will send counselors to get to really know the high schools and establish relationships with the guidance counselors at high schools of their territory, so that they know, like, what's a competitive schedule, what are the most competitive students, what do their grades look like, right? So in a way, then, I would say your probably most direct comparison would be your own classmates. So, you do want to do the best you can. So while many high schools don't rank anymore, how you do relative to your peers will probably be a very solid barometer of how you might do, in college, but not, like I said, again, in absolute terms. It's not like if you're like the third ranked student in your school, the first rank will always beat you in terms of college results. That's where the other factors come into play. Okay. All right. So how do you stand